The morning sun was just breaking through the clouds when Margaret Chen stepped off the bus at the downtown business district. Her heart was beating fast as she looked up at the tall glass building in front of her. Sterling Industries was written in big silver letters across the front, and she had to crane her neck to see the top floors. Margaret adjusted her dark blue dress for the 10th time that morning. It was her best outfit, the one she wore to church on Sundays and to her daughter's school events. She had bought it 3 years ago from a discount store, and while it was clean and pressed, she couldn't help but notice how different it looked compared to the expensive clothes she saw on other people walking into the building. Her hands were shaking slightly as she gripped her old leather purse. Inside was a folder with her resume, printed on regular paper at the library because she didn't have a printer at home. She had spent hours at that library, using the free computer to type up her work experience and practice for interview questions. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, had even helped her format everything properly. Margaret had been working as a night janitor for the past 18 years. Every evening at 10 p.m., she would arrive at various office buildings around the city, cleaning floors, emptying trash cans, and making sure everything was spotless for the next day's workers. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and kept food on the table for her and her daughter Lucy. The job had become even more important after her husband David passed away from cancer 5 years ago. Those medical bills had eaten up most of their savings, and Margaret found herself working extra shifts just to keep up with the mortgage payments. Lucy was now in her 2nd year of college, studying to become a teacher, and Margaret was determined to help her finish school no matter what it took. That's why she was here today, standing outside Sterling Industries, hoping to land a job as an administrative assistant. The pay would be better than her cleaning job, and more importantly, it would be during normal daytime hours. She could finally have evenings free to spend with Lucy when she came home from college. Margaret took a deep breath and walked through the revolving glass doors. The lobby was impressive, with marble floors that reflected the light from a massive chandelier hanging from the ceiling. There were comfortable-looking leather chairs arranged around glass tables, and soft music played in the background. She approached the reception desk where a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair was typing on her computer. The woman looked up and Margaret noticed her eyes quickly scan Margaret's appearance from head to toe. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her tone polite but somewhat cold. "Yes, I'm here for an interview. Margaret Chen. I have an appointment at 10 a.m. for the administrative assistant position." The receptionist frowned slightly and checked her computer screen. "Oh," she said, sounding surprised. "I see. Well, have a seat over there. Someone will be with you shortly." Margaret walked over to the waiting area and chose a chair near the window. As she sat down, she noticed several other people waiting as well. There was a woman in an expensive-looking black suit, checking her phone and tapping her foot impatiently. A man in a crisp white shirt and tie was reviewing papers from a leather briefcase. Another woman wore a designer dress and high heels that probably cost more than Margaret made in a month. Margaret suddenly felt very out of place. She looked down at her simple dress and her worn black shoes that she had polished that morning until they shined as best they could. Her hands, despite the lotion she had applied, still showed the effects of years of cleaning work. There were small calluses from handling mops and vacuum cleaners, and her nails were short and practical rather than the long, manicured ones she saw on the other candidates. The woman in the black suit glanced over at Margaret and whispered something to the man with the briefcase. They both looked in her direction and then quickly looked away, but not before Margaret caught their expressions. It was clear they were wondering what she was doing there. Margaret tried to focus on staying calm. She reminded herself that she was qualified for this job. She had excellent organizational skills from managing her household budget on a tight income. She was reliable. She had never missed a day of work in 18 years unless Lucy was sick. She was good with people, always polite and helpful to the office workers she encountered during her night shifts. More importantly, she had been paying attention all these years. While cleaning offices, she had observed how businesses operated. She noticed which departments ran smoothly and which ones had problems. She saw how some managers treated their employees with respect, while others created stressful environments. She understood more about office dynamics than most people realized. A few more candidates arrived and took seats in the waiting area. Margaret noticed how they all seemed to know each other, or at least moved in the same professional circles. They talked quietly about mutual acquaintances and recent business deals. Their conversations were filled with corporate jargon and references to expensive restaurants and exclusive events. One of the women mentioned her MBA from a prestigious university. Another candidate talked about his previous job at a Fortune 500 company. Margaret listened to these conversations and felt her confidence starting to waver. She had never been to college. Her highest level of education was high school, which she had completed while working part-time to help support her family. The receptionist called out names, and one by one, the other candidates were escorted to interview rooms. Each time someone returned, they looked either confident or disappointed, but none of them seemed as nervous as Margaret felt. As she waited, Margaret thought about Lucy. Her daughter had been so proud when Margaret told her about the interview. "Mom, you're going to do great," Lucy had said over the phone from her dorm room. "You're the smartest person I know and you work harder than anyone. They'd be lucky to have you." Those words gave Margaret strength now. She thought about all the sacrifices she had made over the years, all the late nights and early mornings, all the times she had put Lucy's needs before her own. This interview was about more than just getting a better job. It was about proving to herself that she could succeed in a different world. Finally, the receptionist called her name. "Margaret Chen, they're ready for you now." Margaret stood up, smoothed down her dress one more time, and followed a young man in a suit down a hallway lined with offices. Through the glass walls, she could see people in meetings, working at computers, and talking on phones. This was the world she hoped to join, the world of daytime work and regular hours and maybe eventually respect. The young man stopped at a conference room door and held it open for her. "Good luck," he said with a smile that seemed genuine. Margaret took one last deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked into the room. Whatever happened next, she was determined to represent herself with dignity and show them that she belonged here just as much as anyone else. She had worked too hard and come too far to let fear stop her now. The interview was about to begin, and Margaret Chen was ready to fight for her future. Margaret walked into the conference room and immediately felt the temperature drop. Not literally, but the atmosphere was cold and unwelcoming. 3 people sat behind a long wooden table, each with a stack of papers in front of them and serious expressions on their faces. The woman in the middle looked to be in her early 30s, wearing a sharp gray suit that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. Her dark hair was pulled back in a perfect bun, and she wore glasses that made her look stern and intimidating. To her left sat a young man who couldn't have been older than 25, dressed in an expensive navy suit. He was scrolling through his phone and barely looked up when Margaret entered. The third interviewer was another woman, slightly older, with blonde hair and a burgundy blazer. She was shuffling through papers with an expression that suggested she had better things to do. "Please sit down," the woman in the middle said, gesturing to a single chair placed across from them. Her voice was flat, without any warmth or encouragement. Margaret sat down carefully, placing her purse on the floor beside her chair. She had prepared for this moment, practicing answers in front of her bathroom mirror for weeks. She was ready to talk about her work ethic, her reliability, and her desire to grow in a new career. So, the lead interviewer began, glancing at a paper in front of her. "Margaret Chen, you're applying for our administrative assistant position." She said it like she was reading from a grocery list with no enthusiasm whatsoever. "Yes, that's right," Margaret replied, trying to keep her voice steady and confident. "I'm very excited about this opportunity." The young man finally looked up from his phone. "I see here that you've been working as a janitor." He said the word like it left a bad taste in his mouth. "Yes, for the past 18 years. I've been working night shifts and Night shifts," the blonde woman interrupted, raising her eyebrows. "That's quite different from office work, isn't it? This position requires someone who can handle professional responsibilities during business hours." Margaret felt her cheeks getting warm, but she pressed on. I understand that, and I'm more than ready to make that transition. During my years of cleaning offices, I've actually learned a lot about how businesses operate. I've seen what exactly? The lead interviewer cut her off. Cleaning supplies and empty offices? That's hardly relevant experience for administrative work. The young man leaned back in his chair with a smirk. Do you even have any computer skills? This job requires knowledge of various software programs and systems. Yes, I do, Margaret said, her voice getting slightly defensive despite her efforts to stay calm. I've been taking computer classes at the community center for the past 2 years. I'm familiar with Microsoft Office, email systems, and basic accounting software. I even helped set up a simple database system for my daughter's school fundraising committee. The 3 interviewers exchanged glances, and Margaret could tell they weren't impressed. The blonde woman scribbled something on her notepad that Margaret couldn't see. Tell us about your education, the lead interviewer said. What degree do you have? This was the question Margaret had been dreading. I graduated from high school and have taken some continuing education courses at the community college. I know I don't have a formal degree, but I'm a quick learner and no college degree, the young man said, making a note on his paper. Most of our administrative staff have at least a bachelor's degree. Some have master's degrees in business administration. Margaret felt like she was shrinking in her chair. I understand that formal education is important, but I believe experience and dedication are equally valuable. I've never missed a day of work unless my daughter was seriously ill. I'm always on time. I pay attention to details, and I work well. With people. Working with people, the blonde woman repeated. Have you ever worked in a professional environment? Dealt with clients, managed schedules, coordinated meetings? Well, not in a traditional office setting, but so that's a no, the lead interviewer said, cutting her off again. This position requires someone who can represent our company professionally. Our administrative assistants interact with high-level clients and executives on a daily basis. Margaret looked down at her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. She could feel the 3 pairs of eyes studying her appearance, judging her simple dress and her practical shoes. She knew what they were thinking, that she didn't look the part, that she didn't belong in their corporate world. Let me ask you this, the young man said, leaning forward. Why should we hire you over candidates who have relevant office experience and proper qualifications? Margaret took a deep breath. This was her chance to show them what she was really made of. Because I understand the value of hard work. I know what it means to be dependable and trustworthy. For 18 years, I've been responsible for maintaining professional environments. I've worked alone most of the time, which means I'm self-motivated and don't need constant supervision. She paused, gathering courage. I've also learned things that you can't get from a textbook. I know which departments in office buildings run efficiently and which ones have problems. I've seen how different management styles affect employee morale. I notice details that others might miss because I've spent years making sure everything is perfect. The interviewers looked unimpressed. The blonde woman was actually rolling her eyes slightly. That's all very nice, the lead interviewer said in a condescending tone. But we need someone who can jump right into this role without extensive training. Someone who already understands corporate culture and professional expectations. Do understand professional expectations, Margaret said, her voice getting stronger. Respect, punctuality, attention to detail, confidentiality. These are things I've practiced every day of my working life. The young man chuckled. There's a big difference between mopping floors and managing executive calendars. Are you sure you wouldn't be more comfortable continuing in maintenance work? I'm sure there are janitorial positions available that might be a better fit for your background. Margaret felt her face burn with embarrassment and anger. She had expected some skepticism, but this was outright dismissal and disrespect. These people had already decided she wasn't good enough before she even sat down. I appreciate your honesty, she said, trying to keep her dignity intact, but I applied for this administrative position because I'm ready for a new challenge. I'm not looking to stay in cleaning work forever. The 3 interviewers were barely listening now. The blonde woman was checking her watch and the young man had picked up his phone again. The lead interviewer was already stacking her papers. Well, thank you for coming in today, the lead interviewer said dismissively. We have several more candidates to interview, and we'll be in touch if we need anything further. Margaret knew that tone. It was the same tone people used when they wanted to get rid of you politely. She had heard it before in different situations from people who looked at her and saw only what she appeared to be on the surface. She stood up slowly, picking up her purse with as much dignity as she could manage. "Thank you for your time," she said quietly. As she walked toward the door, she heard the young man whisper something to the others, followed by muffled laughter. Margaret's hands were shaking as she reached for the door handle, but she didn't turn around. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing how much their treatment had hurt her. The interview that was supposed to be her chance for a better life had turned into one of the most humiliating experiences she had ever endured. As she walked out of that conference room, Margaret felt smaller and more defeated than she had in years. All her preparation, all her hope, all her dreams of a different future seemed to crumble in the span of 15 minutes. But she held her head up as she walked down that hallway, because if there was one thing Margaret Chen had learned in her 45 years of life, it was how to maintain her dignity, even when others tried to take it away from her. Margaret walked through the hallway in a daze, her mind replaying every painful moment of the interview. The sound of her modest heels clicking against the polished floor seemed too loud in the quiet corridor. She could still hear the muffled laughter from behind the conference room door, and each echo of it made her stomach twist with shame. She had known the interview might be challenging, but she hadn't expected to be treated with such open disrespect. The way they had looked at her, the way they had dismissed her before she even had a chance to prove herself, it cut deeper than she wanted to admit. Margaret had faced hardship before, but this felt different. This felt personal. As she approached the elevator bank, Margaret fumbled in her purse for a tissue. Her eyes were starting to blur with tears that she was determined not to let fall, at least not here in this building where anyone could see her. She pressed the down button and waited, staring at the floor numbers lighting up as the elevator made its way to her floor. The familiar ding of the elevator arriving made her look up, and she quickly wiped her eyes, hoping to compose herself before stepping inside. But when the door slid open, she found herself face to face with an elderly gentleman who immediately noticed her distress. He was probably in his 70s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and silver hair that was neatly combed but not overly styled. He wore a simple gray suit that looked comfortable rather than expensive, and there was something about his gentle expression that made Margaret feel less alone in that moment. "Oh my," he said softly, stepping slightly to the side to make room for her in the elevator. "Are you all right, dear?" Margaret hesitated for a moment. She had learned to be careful about sharing personal problems with strangers. But something about this man's genuine concern broke down her usual guard. "I'm fine," she said automatically, but her voice betrayed her. It came out shaky and small. The man pressed the lobby button and then looked at her with the kind of understanding that comes from years of life experience. "You know, I've been around long enough to recognize when someone has had a rough day. Sometimes it helps to talk about it." As the elevator began its descent, Margaret found herself opening up to this stranger in a way that surprised her. Maybe it was because he seemed so genuinely interested, or maybe it was because she desperately needed someone to understand what had just happened to her. "I just had the worst job interview of my life," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew it would be challenging, but I didn't expect them to treat me like I was wasting their time." The man nodded thoughtfully. "What kind of position were you interviewing for?" "Administrative assistant," Margaret replied. "I've been working as a night janitor for 18 years, and I thought it was time to try something different. My daughter is in college and the bills keep piling up. I need something that pays better and gives me normal hours." She paused, surprised at how easy it was to talk to this stranger. But they made it clear that someone like me doesn't belong in their world. They kept asking about my education, my professional experience, my background. Everything I said seemed to confirm their belief that I wasn't good enough. The elevator was moving slowly, and Margaret was grateful for the extra time. This conversation was helping her process what had just happened. "Tell me about your work," the man said. 18 years is a long time. You must have learned quite a bit. Margaret's face brightened slightly. Actually, I have. Most people think janitorial work is just cleaning, but it's so much more than that. I've worked in dozens of different office buildings over the years. I've seen how successful companies operate and how struggling ones fall apart. She was getting more animated now, her earlier embarrassment temporarily forgotten. I've noticed that the companies with the best employee morale are usually the most efficient. I've seen departments that work like clockwork because they communicate well, and others that are constantly in chaos because nobody talks to each other. The man was listening intently, nodding at appropriate moments and asking thoughtful questions. For example, Margaret continued, there's this law firm where I worked for 5 years. The partners there always stayed late working on cases, but they also made sure to know their employees' names. They would say good morning to me when they saw me, ask about my family. The whole office ran smoothly because people felt valued. That's very observant, the man said. What else have you noticed? Well, I've learned about efficiency too. When you're cleaning an office, you see which workstations are organized and which ones are disasters. You can tell which employees are overwhelmed and which ones have good systems in place. I've actually developed some ideas about how to improve workflow and reduce waste. Margaret was surprised at how good it felt to share these thoughts with someone who seemed genuinely interested. During her years of night work, she had rarely had the opportunity to discuss her observations with anyone. I've also learned about discretion, she added. In my line of work, you see and hear things. Personal phone calls, confidential documents left on desks, private conversations. I've never once betrayed anyone's trust or shared information that wasn't meant for me. The man smiled. That's an important quality in any professional setting. The interviewers today didn't seem to think so, Margaret said, her mood dampening again. They acted like my experience was worthless. One of them even suggested I should stick to maintenance work because it would be more comfortable for someone with my background. She shook her head, still stung by the memory. I know I don't have a college degree and I know I don't look like the other candidates they're probably interviewing. But I'm not stupid. I work hard. I pay attention, and I care about doing things right. Those are valuable qualities, the man said firmly. More valuable than many people realize. The elevator had reached the lobby, but neither of them moved to get off. Margaret was finding this conversation surprisingly therapeutic. I keep thinking about my daughter, she said. Lucy is so smart, so ambitious. She's studying to be a teacher, and she believes in me more than I believe in myself sometimes. I wanted to show her that I could succeed in something different, that I could be more than just the woman who cleans offices at night. What makes you think you're not already successful? The man asked gently. You've raised a daughter who's... In college, you've maintained steady employment for 18 years. You've kept your family together through difficult times. That sounds like success to me. Margaret felt tears welling up again, but this time they weren't tears of shame. I never thought about it that way. Sometimes we're too close to our own lives to see our accomplishments clearly, he said. Others see what we can't see in ourselves. The elevator doors had closed again and they were alone in the small space. Margaret realized she didn't even know this man's name, but his kindness was exactly what she needed in this moment. I'm sorry, she said suddenly. I don't even know who you are, and here I am telling you my whole life story. The man chuckled softly. Don't apologize. I'm Robert, and I've been with this company for many years. I've seen all kinds of people come and go, and I can tell you that the qualities you possess, integrity, dedication, wisdom gained through experience, those are the things that really matter. Margaret felt a warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time all day, someone had listened to her and treated her with respect. Thank you, Robert, she said. You've been incredibly kind. I hope someday I can return the favor. As the elevator doors opened again at the lobby level, Robert smiled at her. Something tells me you will, Margaret. Something tells me you will. Margaret barely slept that night. She kept replaying the conversation with Robert in her mind, his kind words mixing with the harsh memories of the interview. By morning, she had convinced herself that she would never hear from Sterling Industries again. The whole experience felt like a painful reminder that some doors were simply not meant for people like her. She was making breakfast when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, and for a moment she considered letting it go to voicemail. But something made her answer. "Hello? Is this Margaret Chen?" The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, very different from the dismissive tone she had heard yesterday. "Yes, this is Margaret. This is Patricia from Sterling Industries Human Resources. We need you to come in today for a follow-up meeting regarding your interview yesterday." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. A follow-up meeting? After the way things had gone, she couldn't imagine what they could possibly want to discuss. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" Margaret asked, sure she had misheard. "We need you to return to our offices today at 11 a.m. It's urgent. Can you make it?" Margaret looked at the clock. It was already 9:30, and she would need time to get ready and travel downtown. "Yes, I can be there. Should I prepare? Anything specific?" "Just bring yourself," Patricia said. "Someone will meet you in the lobby." The line went dead, leaving Margaret staring at her phone in confusion. The tone had been completely different from yesterday. Urgent, almost nervous. What could have changed overnight? Margaret spent the next hour getting ready, her mind racing with possibilities. Maybe they wanted to offer her a different position, something more in line with her background. Or maybe they had questions about her references. She tried not to get her hopes up, but she couldn't help feeling a flutter of excitement mixed with anxiety. The bus ride downtown felt longer than usual. Margaret found herself looking out the window at the busy streets, wondering if this could be the day that changed everything. She had been disappointed so many times before that she was afraid to believe something good might actually happen. When she arrived at Sterling Industries, the first thing she noticed was the increased activity in the lobby. There seemed to be more security guards than usual, and several people in expensive suits were having hushed conversations near the elevator bank. The receptionist, who had been so dismissive yesterday, now looked nervous and kept glancing toward the executive floors. "Margaret Chen," she said when she approached the desk. "I'm here for an 11 a.m. meeting." The receptionist's entire demeanor had changed. She was suddenly overly polite, almost frantic in her helpfulness. Yes, of course. Please have a seat. Someone will be right with you." Margaret sat in the same waiting area as yesterday, but the atmosphere was completely different. The receptionist kept looking over at her and whispering into her phone. Other employees walking through the lobby seemed tense and distracted. Within minutes, a man in a navy suit approached her. He was older than the young executive who had escorted her yesterday, and his expression was serious but respectful. "Mrs. Chen, I'm Michael from Executive Services. Would you please come with me?" This was already strange. Yesterday, she had been taken to a small conference room on the 3rd floor. Today, Michael was leading her toward the executive elevator. Bank, the one marked floors 15, 20 only. "Where are we going?" Margaret asked as they stepped into the elevator. "The executive boardroom," Michael replied. "Top floor." Margaret's confusion deepened. The executive boardroom? That didn't make any sense. Why would they take someone who had been essentially dismissed yesterday to the most important meeting room in the building? As the elevator climbed, Margaret tried to calm her nerves. Maybe this was some kind of corporate policy. Perhaps they brought all rejected candidates to a senior manager who delivered the final decision personally. Though that seemed like an unusual waste of executive time. The elevator doors opened. On the 20th floor, revealing a completely different world from the rest of the building, the hallway was wider, with expensive artwork on the walls and thick carpeting that muffled their footsteps. Through glass walls, Margaret could see offices that were larger than her entire apartment. Michael led her to a set of massive wooden doors at the end of the hallway. "Right through here," he said, opening the doors for her. Margaret stepped into the most impressive room she had ever seen. The boardroom was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. A long mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than her monthly salary. But what shocked her most was who was in the room. The 3 interviewers from yesterday, the woman in the gray suit, the young man, and the blonde woman, were standing awkwardly near the far wall. They looked uncomfortable, even nervous, which was a complete reversal from their confident arrogance the day before. and sitting at the head of the massive conference table in an expensive charcoal suit that transformed his entire appearance, was Robert. Margaret's legs felt weak. The kind elderly man from the elevator, the one who had listened to her with such compassion, was sitting in the chair reserved for the most important person in the room. His gray hair was perfectly styled now, and his wire-rimmed glasses caught the light from the windows. The simple suit from yesterday had been replaced by clothing that screamed executive authority. "Please sit down, Margaret," Robert said, his voice carrying a weight and command that hadn't been there in the elevator. Margaret moved toward the chair he indicated as if in a dream. Her mind was struggling to process what she was seeing. This couldn't be the same man, but those kind eyes behind the glasses were unmistakably his. "I believe we need to have a conversation," Robert continued. And suddenly Margaret understood why the three interviewers looked so pale and nervous. "Robert," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He stood up, and when he did, Margaret noticed that everyone else in the room straightened slightly, an automatic response to his presence. "Allow me to properly introduce myself," he said, his tone formal, but not unkind. "I'm Robert Sterling. I'm the founder and CEO of Sterling Industries." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Robert Sterling. The CEO. The man whose name was on the building, whose company employed thousands of people, whose decisions affected countless lives. And she had spent 20 minutes in an elevator telling him about her problems, sharing her observations about business, talking to him like he was just another employee. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "Oh my God," she whispered. Robert, Mr. Sterling, held up a hand. "Please, don't be embarrassed. That conversation yesterday was one of the most enlightening I've had in years." He began walking around the table, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "You see, I make it a habit to move through my company without fanfare. I dress simply, I avoid the executive floors during busy times, and I observe. It's the only way to truly understand what's happening in your own organization." Margaret was still trying to process this revelation. The man who had been so kind to her, who had listened to her thoughts about business and validated her experiences, was the most powerful person in the building. "Yesterday," Robert continued, "I witnessed something that deeply troubled me. I saw how you were treated in that interview, and I heard firsthand about the dismissive attitude you encountered." He turned to face the three interviewers, who looked like they wanted to disappear into the wall. "What I discovered was that the very people responsible for finding talent for my company had completely failed to recognize it when it was sitting right in front of them." Robert Sterling walked slowly around the boardroom table, his footsteps echoing in the tense silence. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat as she tried to process everything that was happening. The three interviewers stood frozen against the wall, their earlier confidence completely shattered. "In 30 years of running this company," Robert began, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority, "I have learned that the most valuable employees are often the ones who don't look like what people expect. They're the ones who understand hard work, who have faced real challenges, and who bring perspectives that others miss." He paused in front of the large windows, looking out at the city below. "Yesterday, in a simple elevator conversation, I learned more about the strengths and weaknesses of various businesses than I have from most quarterly reports. Margaret, your observations about employee morale, workplace efficiency, and organizational culture were remarkably insightful." Margaret felt her cheeks burning. She still couldn't believe that the kind man who had listened to her troubles was actually the CEO of the entire company. Robert turned back to face the room. "But what troubled me even more than discovering this talent was learning how it had been completely dismissed by our hiring team." The lead interviewer, the woman in the gray suit, stepped forward nervously. "Mr. Sterling, if I may explain." "You may not," Robert said firmly, cutting her off. "I've heard enough explanations. What I witnessed yesterday was not a professional evaluation of a candidate's qualifications. It was prejudice, plain and simple." He walked over to Margaret, and to her complete amazement he bowed slightly in front of her chair. The gesture was respectful, almost reverent, and it left everyone in the room speechless. "Margaret Chen," he said formally, "I want to offer you my sincere apology for how you were treated in this building yesterday. That behavior does not represent the values I want this company to embody." Margaret was so shocked she could barely speak. "Mr. Sterling, you don't need to apologize. Yes, I do," he interrupted gently. "Because what happened yesterday revealed a serious problem in our organization. We've become so focused on credentials and appearances that we've forgotten to look for character and wisdom." Robert returned to his position at the head of the table. "Which brings me to why you're here today. I'm not offering you the administrative assistant position you applied for." Margaret's heart sank. Even after everything, even after his apology, she was still being rejected. "Instead," Robert continued, "I'm offering you something much more important. I want to create a new position in this company, and I want you to fill it." Margaret blinked in confusion. "I don't understand." "I'm offering you the position of Director of Workplace Culture and Employee Relations. Your job would be to ensure that every person who walks through our doors is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background. You would also help us identify and develop talent that others might overlook." The room fell completely silent. Margaret stared at Robert, certain she had misunderstood. "Director, but I don't have any management experience. I don't have a college degree. You have something more valuable," Robert said. "You have wisdom earned through years of observing human nature. You understand what makes people feel valued and what drives them to do their best work. You've seen this company from a perspective that none of us in management have ever had." He gestured toward a folder on the table. "I spent all night thinking about our conversation yesterday, your insights about employee morale, about the connection between how people are treated and how well they perform. These are exactly the kinds of perspectives we need at the leadership level." Margaret felt dizzy. This couldn't be real. 24 hours ago she had been humiliated and dismissed, and now the CEO was offering her a director position? "I know this is overwhelming," Robert said, his voice kind again, "but I've built this company by recognizing potential where others don't see it. Yesterday in that elevator, I saw someone who understands people and organizations in ways that can't be taught in business school." He turned to address the 3 interviewers, who had been watching this exchange with growing alarm. "As for our hiring practices, there will be significant changes. These 3 individuals will be attending mandatory training sessions on unconscious bias and professional respect. They will also be working under Margaret's supervision to learn how to properly evaluate candidates." The young man who had been so dismissive yesterday looked like he might faint. "Under her supervision?" he stammered. "That's correct," Robert said firmly. "Margaret will be reviewing all of our hiring procedures and training our staff on how to recognize talent in all its forms. She'll also be implementing new policies to ensure that every candidate receives fair and respectful treatment." Margaret finally found her voice. "Mr. Sterling, I'm incredibly honored, but I need to ask, are you sure about this? I mean, really sure? Because if you're doing this out of pity or guilt—" "Margaret," Robert interrupted, "I didn't build a multi-million-dollar company by making decisions based on pity. I'm offering you this position because I believe you can make Sterling Industries a better place for everyone who works here." He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "Let me tell you what I see when I look at you. I see someone who has managed a household budget for years. That's financial responsibility. I see someone who has worked independently for 18 years without supervision. That's self-motivation and reliability. I see someone who has maintained the trust of clients and employers while handling confidential information. That's integrity." Robert's voice grew more passionate as he continued. "Most importantly, I see someone who has spent years observing organizational behavior and has developed genuine insights about what makes workplaces successful. That combination of experience, wisdom, and character is exactly what we need in leadership." Margaret felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but this time they were tears of hope rather than humiliation. "What would my responsibilities be exactly?" "You would work directly with me to develop company-wide policies on workplace culture. You would oversee all hiring practices to ensure they're fair and inclusive. You would also create programs to help employees at all levels feel valued and supported." Robert smiled. And yes, you would have your own office, a full benefits package, and a salary that reflects the importance of this role. Margaret thought about her daughter Lucy, about all the years of struggling to make ends meet, about all the times she had felt invisible and undervalued. Could this really be happening? There's one condition, Robert added. I want you to continue your education. The company will pay for you to take business courses at the local university. Not because you need them to do this job, but because I believe in investing in our people's growth. Margaret looked around the boardroom, at the expensive furniture, and the panoramic view of the city. Just yesterday she had felt so small and out of place in this building. Now she was being offered the chance to help shape how this company treated people like her. Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice steady, despite her emotions, I accept your offer, and I promise you won't regret giving me this chance. Robert stood up and extended his hand to her. Welcome to the Sterling Industries leadership team, Director Chen. As Margaret shook his hand, she thought about all the people who had ever been dismissed or overlooked because they didn't fit someone's narrow definition of what success looked like. Now she would be in a position to make sure that never happened again in this company. The three former interviewers looked on in stunned silence as Margaret Chen, the woman they had treated with such disrespect just one day earlier, officially became their supervisor. Sometimes, Margaret realized, life has a way of surprising everyone, including the people who think they have all the power. Her journey from night janitor to company director had taken 18 years and one remarkable elevator conversation. But as she looked out at the city from the 20th floor, Margaret knew that her real work was just beginning.